They thought they could mess with the stranger, but they had no idea who they were up against. A gang of rockers decided to start something, but in less than a minute, they realized they had made a huge mistake. Subscribe and drop a comment with your city. Let's see where you're watching from. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, a lonely ribbon of asphalt cutting through the vast American wilderness. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a sky brushed in deep purples and navy blues. Stars were just beginning to poke through the darkness, but the world below remained still, except for the low, distant hum of a truck's engine. Behind the wheel of a dust-covered, battle-worn pickup sat Chuck Norris. His hands steady, his eyes sharp, scanning the empty road ahead. The night was calm, but Chuck knew better. Calm could be deceiving. A lifetime on the move had taught him that trouble always lurked just around the corner. The radio crackled softly, playing an old country song, slow, melancholic, the kind of tune that spoke of long roads and memories best left in the past. But Chuck wasn't listening. His focus was on the drive, on the feel of the road beneath his tires. The dashboard clock read just past midnight. He had been driving for hours, and while exhaustion hadn't caught up to him yet, he knew a short break wouldn't hurt. Then he saw it. A flickering neon sign glowing faintly in the distance, a roadside bar. The only sign of civilization for miles, a lone outpost in the middle of nowhere. A place where truckers, drifters, and the occasional lost soul could grab a drink, a meal, or just a moment to breathe before disappearing back onto the open road. Chuck eased off the gas, rolling into the parking lot. A few rusted pickups, an old semi parked in the back, and a line of motorcycles near the entrance. He eyed them for a second. He knew the type. Not real bikers, rockers. The kind that walked into a place like they owned it, loud, obnoxious, looking for trouble. He had seen their kind before. Cutting the engine, he stepped out, stretching his legs. The air was thick with the scent of dust and the faint promise of rain. A storm was coming. Chuck glanced up at the sky, then turned his attention to the bar. Big AL's Roadhouse. The neon sign buzzed weakly, casting a red glow across the gravel lot, giving the place an eerie, almost forgotten feel. Without hesitation, Chuck pushed open the heavy wooden door. Inside, the smell of cheap beer, grilled meat, and cigarette smoke hit him like an old memory. The place was dimly lit, a jukebox in the corner barely managing to play a classic rock tune over the low hum of conversation. A few patrons scattered around, an older trucker nursing a whiskey, a couple of guys playing pool near the back, and then them. The rockers. They took up the farthest corner, a group of men in worn leather jackets, their patches and logos long faded. They talked loud, laughed harder, boots propped up on chairs like they owned the place. Beer bottles cluttered their table. They weren't here to ride. They were here to make sure everyone knew they were in charge. Chuck didn't give them a second glance. He walked straight to the bar, sat down, and nodded at the bartender. A burly man, graying hair, tired eyes. "Coffee," Chuck said. The bartender studied him for a moment, deciding whether Chuck belonged here. Then, with a nod, he turned to pour the drink. Chuck sat in silence. Watching. Listening. Years of experience had taught him that trouble always announces itself before it arrives. And tonight, it was coming straight from the corner where the rockers sat. He could feel their eyes on him. The muttered words. The quiet laughter. It was only a matter of time. They thought they could size him up, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. A gang of rockers wanted to make a statement, but in less than a minute, they realized they had made a huge mistake. Subscribe and drop a comment with your city. Let's see where you're watching from. The laughter behind him wasn't the kind that came from a good joke. Chuck Norris didn't need to hear the words to know exactly what was happening. They were testing him, sizing him up, trying to decide just how far they could push. He took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle in. He hadn't come here looking for a fight, but deep down, he already knew it wasn't his decision to make. He had seen this play out too many times before. The air in the bar shifted. He could feel it. That subtle, heavy change when men start convincing themselves they have something to prove. Chuck sat there, fingers wrapped around the ceramic cup, eyes on nothing in particular, but listening to everything. People always gave themselves away before they made a move. A shift in tone. A change in posture. The hesitation between words. It was all there if you knew how to read it. And tonight, the signs were clear. Behind him, the rockers were getting restless. Not outright hostile, not yet, but different. The moment he walked in, the energy had changed. He could feel their stares pressing into his back, could hear the shift in their conversation, the muttered remarks, the laughter that was just a little too loud. They were used to being the biggest threat in the room. The bartender set the coffee in front of Chuck, wiping his hands on a rag. He leaned in slightly, voice low. "You sure you want to be here?" Chuck lifted the cup, took a slow sip, then answered, "Just passing through." The bartender glanced past Chuck's shoulder, then back. "Might want to keep it that way." Chuck didn't respond. He didn't need to. A chair scraped against the floor. Heavy boots moved across the wooden planks, deliberate, unhurried. The first approach. Chuck didn't turn around. He just waited. The man stopped just outside his peripheral vision, close enough that Chuck could smell the stale mix of beer and cigarettes clinging to his jacket. The silence stretched for a beat too long. Then came the voice. "You lost, old man?" Chuck set his cup down, finally turning his head just enough to get a look. Tall. Broad shoulders. Thick around the middle, the kind of strength that had long since softened from too many easy victories and too many heavy drinks. A faded emblem on the back of his jacket, some old band's logo. The rocker smiled, but there was no humor in it. He was pushing. Testing. Chuck held his gaze for a second, then turned back to his coffee. No. It was short. Dismissive. And that was enough. A second man joined the first, this one younger, leaner, but with the same smug look. He leaned against the bar beside Chuck, way too close for it to be anything but intentional. That a fact? The younger one smirked. "See, the thing is, this ain't really a place for." He trailed off, dragging the sentence out, letting the insult linger in the air. Chuck didn't need to hear the rest to know exactly how it was going to end. But before the kid could push it any further, a voice cut through the room like a blade. "That's enough." The tone was casual, but the weight behind it was final. The two rockers hesitated, then stepped aside. Chuck finally turned slightly, getting a full look at the man who had spoken. Ray Thunder Miller. Even sitting down, he was a presence. The kind of man who didn't need to demand attention, it was just there, built into the way he carried himself. His long, graying hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, his beard thick but kept in check. His black leather jacket was old, scuffed, the sleeves pushed up to reveal tattooed forearms. Unlike the others, Ray wasn't smiling. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "I don't think our friend here meant any harm," he said, eyes locked on Chuck. Sharp. Assessing. "Did you, cowboy?" Chuck didn't answer right away. He studied him instead. Posture. Tone. The way the others deferred to him. The leader. Chuck knew his type. He had seen men like Ray before. Men who had spent their lives on top, not just because they were the strongest, but because no one had dared to challenge them in a long, long time. Chuck took another sip of coffee. No harm intended. Ray nodded slowly, like he was turning the words over in his head. Then, finally, he smirked. "You see," he said, glancing at his men. "The man's just here for coffee." He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Ain't that something?" The tension in the room should have eased. It didn't. Because even as Ray leaned back, even as he waved his men away, Chuck knew exactly what was coming next. Ray was the kind of man who needed to be the center of the universe. The one calling the shots. And Chuck's presence? That was a problem. They thought they could push him around, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. A gang of rockers wanted to make a statement, but in less than a minute, they realized they had made the biggest mistake of their lives. Subscribe and drop a comment with your city. Let's see where you're watching from. Ray wasn't done. He took a slow sip of his beer, then set the bottle down with a heavy thud. "You know," he said, his tone shifting, "it's funny. You see a man like you, someone who don't belong, and it makes you wonder." Chuck didn't react. Ray's smirk widened. "Makes you wonder why he thinks he can just walk into a place like this and not show respect." The word respect hung in the air, thick and heavy with meaning. A low chuckle came from one of the rockers behind Chuck. Chuck exhaled through his nose. He had hoped it wouldn't come to this. But it always did, didn't it? He pushed his coffee cup forward, tapping the rim lightly with his fingers. Then, without looking up, he spoke. "I don't start trouble." A pause. A flicker of something unreadable crossed Ray's face. Then, slowly, the smirk faded. Ray's jaw tightened. And then, with deliberate intent, he reached out and knocked Chuck's coffee cup off the bar. Ceramic shattered against the floor. The room went silent. Chuck stared at the spilled coffee for a long moment. Then, he lifted his gaze. Ray smiled. "Well now," he murmured. "What do you think about that, cowboy?" Chuck didn't answer. Because by now, he already knew how this was going to end. The broken ceramic lay scattered across the floor, dark stains of coffee seeping into the worn wooden planks. The air in the bar had changed. Gone was the casual bravado of men drinking together. Gone was the mild curiosity that had followed Chuck since he stepped inside. Now, there was only expectation. Ray leaned back in his chair, watching. Amused. Waiting. He liked this moment, the pause before things escalated. The slow, inevitable build to violence. Around him, his men shifted. Subtle movements. Hands resting too casually on their belts. Shoulders angling just slightly. Predators sensing weakness. But Chuck Norris wasn't weak. He exhaled slowly, as if weighing his options. But in reality, he had already made his decision. Ray had made sure of that the moment he knocked over the coffee. This wasn't going to end with Chuck walking out untouched. They wouldn't let it. Chuck wasn't one for theatrics. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a few bills, and placed them on the counter. A quiet acknowledgement of the coffee he never got to finish. For a fleeting moment, it almost looked like he might just stand up and leave. And that thought, the idea of being ignored, of being denied the fight they wanted, made one of the younger rockers chuckle. A sharp, derisive sound. That was all it took. A stool scraped against the floor. Movement at the edge of Chuck's vision. A heavy-set man stepped toward him from the left, the first to test the water. The man didn't go straight for a punch. He wasn't that reckless. Instead, he shoved Chuck's shoulder. A dare. Chuck didn't move. The younger rocker grinned. "Looks like the old man's got some sense," he muttered. Then came the second shove. Harder. That was a mistake. Chuck's hand shot out too fast. Fingers locking around the man's wrist in an iron grip. No hesitation. No wasted motion. A sharp twist. The rocker stumbled forward, off balance. Chuck's knee came up, hard and precise, slamming into the man's ribs. Air left his lungs in a gasping whoosh before he even realized what had happened. A second later, Chuck released him. The man crumpled to the floor, clutching his side, wheezing. Silence. A heartbeat. Then chaos. Another man came in fast. A fist swung for Chuck's head. Chuck ducked. Sidestepped. Brought his elbow up, a brutal strike under the man's jaw. The impact sent the rocker sprawling backward, crashing against an empty table. Beer bottles shattered. Another lunged at him, a broken pool cue raised like a weapon. Chuck caught his wrist, twisted sharply, the makeshift club clattered to the floor. One clean punch to the gut. The rocker folded, doubling over. Chuck shoved him aside, sending him sprawling. The bar was alive with movement now. Uninvolved patrons scrambled away. Tables overturned. Chairs crashed. The bartender? Nowhere to be seen. Two more came at him together, thinking numbers would give them an advantage. The first threw a wild punch. Chuck caught his arm mid-swing. A sharp, driving fist into the ribs. The second barely had time to react before Chuck's boot slammed into his knee. A sharp crack. The man collapsed. It was over in seconds. Bodies lay groaning on the ground. Some still conscious. Some not. Chuck adjusted his jacket, rolled his shoulders. Not a single drop of sweat on him. And then he turned. Because Ray Thunder Miller was still sitting. Still watching. Still smiling. And Chuck knew. It wasn't over yet. They thought they could break him. But now, the real fight was about to begin. The rockers lay scattered across the bar, clutching their ribs, gasping for breath. Some rolled onto their backs, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The entire fight had lasted seconds. But the outcome was undeniable. They were beaten. And yet, it wasn't over. Because Ray Thunder Miller hadn't moved. The leader of the pack sat still, watching. Expression unreadable. He hadn't stepped in. Hadn't fought alongside his men. He had let them attack first. Let them test the stranger. Let them lose. And now it was his turn. Slowly, Ray leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. Chuck met his gaze. Waiting. Ray exhaled, shaking his head. Well, he muttered. Looks like we got ourselves a real tough guy. Chuck said nothing. Ray rolled his shoulders, rising to his feet. Unlike the others, there was no hesitation in his movement. No sign of nerves. No uncertainty. He was taller than Chuck, broader. A man who had spent his life fighting and had come out on top more times than not. And unlike his men, he wasn't reckless. He reached down, grabbed a chair, and casually swung it around, setting it upright again. Then, with the same unsettling smirk, he cracked his knuckles. And stepped forward. Let's see how tough you really are. This was the real fight. For a long moment, Ray stood motionless, rolling his shoulders, loosening himself up. He wasn't in a hurry. He had been watching. The way Chuck moved. The way he fought. The way he dismantled each attacker with precision, no wasted motion, no hesitation. Ray knew now. This wasn't some lost traveler passing through town. This wasn't some unsuspecting victim who had wandered into the wrong bar. This was someone different. Someone dangerous. And Ray wanted to test him. The bar was dead silent. The only sounds were the muffled groans of the beaten men sprawled across the floor. The few remaining patrons, truckers and locals who had wisely stayed out of the fight, stood frozen, backs pressed against the walls, watching. Eyes wide. Chuck didn't move. Didn't flinch. He had been in situations like this before. He knew exactly what came next. Ray flexed his fingers once. Then he stepped forward. Boots heavy against the wooden floor. Deliberate. Measured. Calculated. For a second, it seemed like he might say something. Then, without warning, he struck. Ray moved fast. Faster than a man his size should. His fist cut through the air in a brutal arc, aimed straight at Chuck's jaw. But Chuck? He was already ahead of him. A slight tilt of his head. The punch sailed past, missing by inches. Ray's momentum carried him forward. And Chuck? He took the opening. A sharp, controlled strike, palm driving into Ray's chest. Enough force to send him stumbling back a step. Not enough to drop him. Not yet. But it was a message. A warning. Ray's smirk returned. "All right," he muttered under his breath. Then he charged. The fight exploded into motion. Ray swung again. Chuck blocked it, caught his wrist in an iron grip. A twist. Pressure applied. But Ray was strong. Stronger than the others. He powered through, ripping his arm free with brute force. Then a knee. Driving toward Chuck's ribs fast. Brutal. Chuck twisted, absorbing the impact. It hurt. But pain? Pain was nothing new. Ray didn't stop. Another punch. Then another. Heavy. Relentless. Precision mixed with raw power. Chuck dodged. Sidestepped. Deflected where he could. But Ray wasn't like the others. This wasn't intimidation. Ray was a fighter. A man who had spent his life throwing punches and taking them in return. A bottle shattered behind them. Someone shouted. The bartender yelled for them to take it outside. But his voice was distant. Irrelevant. Ray faked left, then swung hard for Chuck's ribs. Chuck blocked it. Forearm absorbing the hit. Then he snapped forward. A brutal punch, driving into Ray's stomach. Ray grunted, stumbling back. But only for a second. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Then he grinned. Not bad. Then he reached down, grabbed a bar stool, and swung. Fast. Hard. The wooden seat cut through the air, aimed straight at Chuck's head. He ducked, just in time. But Ray wasn't done. Because the second Chuck dodged, Ray was already moving. The real fight? It was just getting started. They thought they could take him down. But now? It was about to end. Ray wasn't finished. With a sharp twist of his grip, he swung the bar stool in a powerful overhead arc, aiming to bring it crashing down on Chuck's skull. Chuck had no choice but to step back. The stool slammed into the floor, splinters flying from the impact. Had he been a second slower, it would have been over. Ray tossed the broken stool aside, his eyes burning with something between fury and exhilaration. "Come on," he taunted. "Thought you were tough." Chuck didn't answer. He moved. Fast. Before Ray could react, Chuck closed the distance, his foot snapping forward, striking Ray's knee. A sharp grunt ripped from the bigger man's throat as his leg buckled. Chuck didn't give him a chance to recover. A punch to the ribs. Another, straight to the jaw. Ray staggered. But he didn't fall. Instead, he growled low in his throat, shaking his head, trying to clear it, trying to push past the pain. Then, with renewed fury, he lunged. Ray slammed into Chuck, tackling him backward, driving him into the bar with the full force of his weight. Bottles rattled on the shelves behind them. Chuck felt the wood bite into his back, but he didn't let the position work against him. He adapted. An elbow, down hard on the back of Ray's neck. Once. Twice. Ray's grip loosened. That was all Chuck needed. He slipped free, twisted, and in one fluid motion, grabbed Ray by the collar of his leather jacket. Then, with a sharp pivot of his hips, he sent the man crashing over the bar counter. Ray hit the ground with a heavy thud, knocking over bottles and glasses, liquor splashing across the floor as he rolled onto his side. The bartender swore loudly. Neither man paid him any mind. Chuck stepped back. Breathing steady. Stance solid. He had been in too many fights like this to make the mistake of thinking it was over. Because until a man stayed down, it wasn't. And Ray? Ray wasn't staying down. The big man groaned, pushed himself up. For a moment, he just stood there, chest rising and falling with deep, heavy breaths. Then, slowly, he looked at Chuck. The smirk was gone. Ray exhaled, shaking his head. "You should have just finished your coffee," he muttered. Then, his hand darted toward his belt. A knife. The blade flashed in the dim bar light. And in that split second, Chuck knew. Ray had just made his final mistake. Because Chuck didn't hesitate. He moved. Before Ray could even bring the knife up, Chuck was already on him. They thought they could stop him. They thought they could win. But now, it was over. With a single step, Chuck closed the distance. His hand shot out, locking onto Ray's wrist. A sharp twist. Controlled. Precise. Brutal. The knife was ripped from Ray's grasp before he could even react, spinning uselessly across the floor. Ray grunted, frustration flashing in his eyes, but he was too slow to stop what came next. A sharp jab to the throat. Not enough to crush. Just enough to stun. Ray choked. His body seized up. And in that moment, Chuck swept his legs out from under him. Ray hit the floor. Hard. The impact rattled through his spine, his breath tearing from his lungs as he lay sprawled across the wooden planks. The room was silent. The knife lay motionless a few feet away. For the first time since the fight began, Ray didn't get up. He just stared at the ceiling. His chest rose and fell in uneven, shallow gasps. Around them, the rockers still standing, the ones still conscious, looked between their fallen leader and Chuck. Their faces? Shock. Disbelief. Chuck took a step back. His expression? Unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned. Walked back to the bar. Picked up the bills he had left earlier. Placed them down again. "Get a new cup," he said to the bartender. Then, he sat down. As if nothing had happened at all. The bar was silent. The acrid scent of spilled alcohol hung thick in the air. Cigarette smoke curled lazily, clinging to the walls like the ghost of a night that had gone wrong. Only the occasional groan of a fallen rocker broke the oppressive quiet. Ray Thunder Miller still lay on the floor. Breathing ragged. Body aching. But the worst pain wasn't in his ribs. It was in his pride. For years, he had walked into places like this, taken whatever space he wanted, ruled through fear alone. People knew his name. Knew his reputation. And almost no one had dared to challenge him. Even fewer had beaten him. Yet now, here he was. Gasping for air. Staring at the ceiling. His body heavy with the weight of defeat. And the man who had done it sat calmly at the bar, drinking coffee. Chuck hadn't gloated. Hadn't taunted. Hadn't rubbed it in. He had just done what needed to be done. And that, more than anything, was what made Ray's blood boil. He had underestimated this man. Misread him completely. Chuck Norris wasn't just some passerby who had walked into the wrong bar. He was something else. Something Ray didn't fully understand. Ray flexed his fingers against the wooden floor, testing his limbs, feeling the dull throb radiating through his muscles. He could have let it end there. Could have admitted defeat. But men like Ray didn't quit. They didn't accept losses. They took victories, no matter the cost. With a slow, steady breath, Ray rolled onto his side. Then, he pushed himself up. The movement was careful. Deliberate. But not hesitant. He was hurt. But not finished. Behind the bar, the bartender saw it first. His eyes widened. His mouth opened as if to say something, but no words came. Because he saw the gleam of the knife before anyone else did. Ray's fingers twitched toward his belt. His grip, sure. Practiced. He wasn't a man who hesitated with a weapon in his hand. He had used it before. And he would use it now. Chuck set his cup down. His movements slow. Deliberate. The same way they had been from the moment he walked into the bar. He didn't look surprised. He simply looked disappointed. Ray lunged. The blade sliced through the air, cold steel flashing under dim bar lights. It was a strike meant to end things, to turn the tide. But Chuck, he was already moving. A shift, just enough to avoid the thrust. Flowing like a man who had spent a lifetime knowing exactly how to react to danger. His hand shot out, locked onto Ray's wrist. A sharp twist. Controlled. Brutal. Final. The knife clattered to the floor. Ray barely had time to register the loss before Chuck struck. A jab clean, sharp, to the throat. Not enough to crush, but enough to stun. Ray staggered. His breath hitched. His balance gone. Chuck didn't give him time to recover. A step forward. A strike to the ribs. Another to the jaw. Each blow deliberate. Calculated. Chuck never wasted movement. Never threw wild punches. Everything had purpose. Everything was measured. Ray's body betrayed him. His legs gave out. His vision blurred. His chest burned. His mind screamed at him to keep fighting. To get up. To do something. But his body refused. He hit the floor. Again. And this time, he knew. It was over. The bar remained silent. The rockers, the ones still conscious, didn't move. Didn't speak. The bravado? Gone. The laughter? Dead. They had watched their leader fall twice. And they knew, just as well as Ray did, there was no coming back from this. Chuck turned to the bartender. "Coffee's good," he said simply. The bartender hesitated. Then, a small nod. Chuck reached into his pocket, pulled out a few more bills, and set them down. For the damage. Then, without another word, he turned. Walked toward the door. The wooden planks creaked beneath his boots. The sound, unusually loud in the hush that had fallen over the bar. He pushed open the door. Stepped out into the night. The air was cool. Heavy with the scent of rain. A storm was coming. Behind him, inside the bar, Ray still lay on the floor. And for the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. Chuck stepped onto the porch. The neon sign buzzed softly. Its red glow stretched long shadows across the empty parking lot. The motorcycles. The beaten-up trucks. The wreckage inside, unknown to the world outside. The truck sat where he had left it. Waiting. He stepped off the porch. Behind him, inside the bar, Ray finally moved. Pulled himself up. Stepped into the doorway. For a long moment, he and Chuck locked eyes. There was no anger now. No bravado. Just understanding. Ray gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Chuck returned it. Then, he shifted the truck into gear. Pressed down on the gas. And drove into the night. The storm still gathering. The road stretching endlessly ahead. And, as always, Chuck Norris kept moving forward. If you enjoyed this video, hit subscribe for more action-packed stories. Share it with your friends and drop a comment below. See you in the next one.